If the pattern tells you to separate two groups of stitches by binding off stitches in the middle of the row, start by placing a locking stitch marker or a safety pin at each side of that group of stitches that are supposed to be bound off. Do it before you start the right side row, and make sure that the groups of stitches that are at the left hand side and the right hand side of that group of stitches have the same number of stitches. And then simply start to work the row. Usually we do it in the main stitch pattern of the project, but sometimes pattern might give you different instructions, so read your pattern carefully. And stop when you get to the first marker. Then take a strand of the same yarn, just from a different ball or the other end from the same ball of yarn. There is no need to attach it in any special way. Simply leave a tail that is long enough to weave in later and use that strand to knit the first stitch from the tip of the left needle. Just like this, you insert the needle into that stitch and you simply use this strand to wrap the tip of the right needle. You can do it with this yarn in your right hand or with the yarn in your left hand, doesn't matter at all. And pull that wrap through and let the tail hang there, waiting for the time when you weave it in. And then use this strand, the new one, the newly attached, introduced one, and the other strand is resting. We are not touching it anymore for now in this row. And use this new strand to knit the next stitch, then pass one stitch over the other, binding off one stitch. And keep going until you bind off the number of stitches that you need to bind off, and that would be basically all stitches between the markers, and you will also work one stitch past the second marker and then bind it off. So now we are left with two groups of stitches that have the same number of stitches, even though in this group these stitches are kind of separated. One stitch is on the right needle, the rest is on the left, but still the number is the same. I have 7 stitches over here and 7 stitches over here. And we bound off the center group of stitches. We don't need markers anymore, we can remove them, or you can do it later when you finish the row. Doesn't make any difference. And then we continue to work to the end of the row on the second group of stitches using this second strand of yarn. Just like this. So that's how we separate the stitches, and that's how we make sure each group of stitches has a dedicated strand of yarn. And now if the pattern tells us to work stitches even, then we turn the work and we use this strand to work this group of stitches, and we use this strand to work this group of stitches, and then we turn the work again and continue in the same fashion, knitting or purling or doing whatever stitch pattern you like, building these two sides of the bound off stitches even. But in most cases, the first row, the row where we bind off stitches, is just the beginning of the shaping. And the pattern will tell us, for example, to bind off 2 stitches at neck edge. And because we can bind off stitches only at the beginning of a row, we can't bind off stitches at the end of a row. That's why we're gonna work these 2 groups of stitches a little bit in a different way, because the neck edge, where let's say it's a neckline, right? The neck edge will be at the end of the row for this group of stitches and at the beginning of the row for this group of stitches, when we are looking at the right side of the work. When we turn the work and look at the wrong side of the work, that's when this group of stitches has the beginning of the row at the neck edge. That's when we are able to bind off those 2 stitches. So if that's the case, if that's the instructions that the pattern gives us, it could be 2 stitches or 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. I'm just showing you the process. So if that's the case and we need to bind off, let's say 2 stitches at the neck edge, we work this group of stitches without any changes. We simply, in my case, purl all stitches because it's stockinette stitch, but you work in the stitch pattern of your project. But you don't do anything to these stitches yet, not in this row. So we work to the end. It's the same number of stitches. We haven't bound off anything because we can only bind off from the beginning of the row, and we don't need to bind off from this edge. We need to bind off over here. So we have to wait for the next row. Then we drop this strand, pick up the strand that belongs to this group of stitches, and that's when we can bind off those two stitches, at least in this group of stitches. So I will bind off as purls to make sure I have a nice chain of stitches forming on the right side of the work. You can bind off in pattern or as knits. It's totally up to you. So I bind off 2 stitches. Now I have 5 stitches instead of 4 here and 1 here, instead of 7. So I bound off 2 stitches and I finish working these stitches using the strand that belongs to that group of stitches that is attached there. Then I would turn the work and let's see what we have. This group of stitches has not changed, it just grew a little bit bigger, but the number of stitches is the same. This group of stitches already has those 2 bound off stitches, and that's great. In this row, in the right side row, we use again the same strand that belongs to this group of stitches. We never change the strands. And with every row, frankly, it becomes more difficult to get confused because the strand clearly is attached to this group of stitches. So we don't do anything in this row to the group of stitches that already has 2 stitches bound off. We simply work these stitches in pattern. But when we move to the next group of stitches, that's when we can finally bind off those 2 stitches that we need to bind off. So I knit 2 stitches, bind off 1, knit 1 more, bind off. And here we go. We have 2 stitches bound off over here. We have 2 stitches bound off over here. And yes, because we did it in different rows, simply because it is not possible to bind off stitches at the end of the row, we have to make this little sacrifice. We did it in different rows, and that's why this kind of step is a little bit higher than this step. And as you do more of this type of shaping, binding off, let's say 2 stitches at the end of at the neck edge, again 1 more time and 2 more times, you will notice that these steps are a little bit misaligned, and that's okay. We did the best we could. We cannot do anything to improve it. We can do a few things to improve other parts of this shaping, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. For now, let's finish this row, and now we know how to work 2 groups of stitches at the same time as we bind off a certain number of stitches from the neck edge. Because most often this type of shaping is used in necklines. That's why these are the instructions that you will most likely see in a pattern. So they say to bind off from the neck edge. See what we did? We just added more curviness to this part of the project. And then if we are working even and we don't need to bind off anything else, we simply turn the work and work the first group of stitches in pattern using the strand that belongs to that group, drop that strand, move to the second group, pick up the strand that belongs to that group, and work the second group of stitches, just as usual in the main stitch pattern of the project. So that's what we do when we are supposed to work even. We don't do any decreases and we don't bind off any stitches. Sometimes the pattern will give us different type of instructions. If the shaping is not as steep as it is over here, and the curve is more smooth, then the pattern will tell us decrease 1 stitch at neck edge in every right side row, for example, or in every 4th row, or every 8th row, or whatever the pattern instructions are. But the thing is that unlike binding off, we can make decreases at the beginning and at the end of a row without any problems. We can make decreases anywhere for that matter, right? So for us it is much easier because we don't have to plan and bind off stitches in one row for one group, and then the next row it's going to be the next group. So we don't have to do any of that. We can do both decreases in one shot in one right side row, and then move to the next row, just relaxing and working stitches in pattern. So how do we do that? For best results, it is always a good idea to place the decrease, because we are still adding decreases at the neck edge. It is a good idea to add the decrease so that there is 1 stitch left at the edge. So the decrease won't be at the edge itself, it will be right here, and 1 stitch will be the edge stitch. It gives a much better look. So that's what I usually do, and that's what I recommend doing because of the result. The result is much better. To make that decrease, work all stitches in pattern until you get to the last 3 stitches of that group. And then we knit 2 stitches together the usual way. We insert the needle from left to right into 2 stitches at the same time, then wrap the tip of the needle with the yarn, whether you hold yarn in your right hand or left hand doesn't matter, and then you knit these 2 stitches together, and then we are left with this 1 edge stitch. We simply knit it. So that's how we do the decrease at the right hand side of the shaping. Then we drop this strand, pick up the strand that belongs to the other group, knit 1 stitch, and then we make a slip knit decrease. You can use the classic way, but I usually use a simplified version where I slip just 1 stitch and then return it back to the left needle and push the right needle a little bit further until it gets into the 2nd stitch. Then wrap the needle with the yarn again, right hand, left hand, doesn't matter. Just wrap the yarn as you do for knitting. Pull that wrap through, and ta-dam, we made the decrease. And then finish the row. So we made both decreases in the same right side row, and as we keep adding decreases, you will see that this decreasing line will nicely curve over there, and this decreasing line will go to the left hand side of the fabric, forming a lovely line of decreases at the neckline or whatever shaping it is. Once we do that, we turn the work and simply work all stitches in pattern without worrying about binding off anything or decreasing anything else. We did our decreases, and now we can relax and work stitches in pattern. But of course, remember to switch the strands. So work stitches of a certain group only with the strand that belongs to that group. And that's how we work 2 groups of stitches at the same time while doing different kinds of shaping. And of course, you keep going on and on and on, and then follow the pattern instructions, and finally bind off stitches or make the shoulder decreases. So it's all up to the pattern, but this is the basic process how we can add shaping, the U shaping to our projects. Most often it would be a neckline, but it could also be a top of a tote bag or some other projects that need that type of shaping. And this is just the basic process. There are a few things we can improve here. First of all, you see that this gap does not look good at all. This is the place where we started binding off stitches, and there is a way to make this corner, to make that gap disappear and make this corner much neater. There is also a simple way to avoid forming steps when we bind off stitches at the neckline shaping. This method is very simple. It's called sloped bind off, and it removes the steps and make the shaping more curvy. I will leave links to both tutorials, the one that explains how to make this corner neater and the one that shows how to make slope bind off. I will leave both links in the video description. Those methods will help you make the shaping much neater.
If you find this tutorial helpful, please subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon to be notified every time I publish a new video. Happy knitting, my friend. I'll talk to you in the next tutorial.